The chamber smelled of incense and despair. 300 delegates from 61 species sat in the grand conclave of Velharith, and not one of them spoke. On the projection above their heads, a star, Aurelian Prime, population 4.2 billion, blinked out like a candle pinched between two fingers. Just like that. Gone. Ambassador Sireth of the Velkari stood at the central podium, his 4 arms clasped tightly against his torso, a gesture his species reserved for moments of genuine terror. He was 312 years old. He had survived the collapse of the Trathian Rings, the Gret Plague, 2 civil wars. He had never once prayed to anything. He was praying now. The Vreth have consumed 11 systems in 42 planetary cycles, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The chamber's acoustics carried it perfectly, which made it worse somehow. The Aurelian Defense Fleet, 2,000 warships, the finest in the sector, was destroyed in under 8 minutes. Our psychic suppressors do nothing. Our weapons pass through them. Every species that has engaged them directly, he stopped, swallowed, has ceased to exist. The Vreth, ancient things, beings of pure consuming energy that had slept in the space between dimensions for longer than most civilizations had kept written history. Something had cracked the seal. Something had let them through. And now they were feeding, and they would not stop, and nothing in the known galaxy had the means to fight them. Nothing except, perhaps, one species no one had thought worth watching. Delegate Mur of the Korathi spoke first, her crystalline voice thin with reluctance. You cannot seriously be proposing the humans. I am, Sireth said. They have barely left their own solar system. They have no psychic ability. Their technology is primitive by any standard we. They have something else, Sireth interrupted. He pulled up a secondary file on the projection, a record, dense, blood-soaked, thousands of years long. Our intelligence division spent 6 months compiling this. It is a history of human warfare, internal warfare, wars they fought against each other. He paused to let that settle. In roughly 4,000 years, they have engaged in over 14,000 distinct military conflicts. They developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet and nearly used them twice. They invented biological agents, psychological weapons, systematic torture, not against alien invaders, but against themselves. His eyes swept the chamber. I am not recommending them because they are noble. I am recommending them because they are the only species in this galaxy that has spent its entire evolutionary history specifically training to kill things that do not want to die. Silence. Then Delegate Mur very quietly, and they agreed to come. Sireth looked down at the response file on his data pad. It had arrived 17 minutes after the Conclave's distress signal reached Earth. Not a diplomatic reply, not a committee decision, just a file, clean, efficient. A personnel dossier for 12 individuals attached to a single sentence that read, "We're already packed. Send coordinates." They agreed, he confirmed. No one in the chamber slept that night. Some spent the hours studying the human history file, growing progressively more disturbed. Others watched the edge of the Vreth advance on the star maps, calculating how long before it reached the core worlds. A few delegates quietly made arrangements, messages to families, last recordings, the small dignities of people who were not certain they would survive the month. Sireth stood alone at the observation window, watching the dark between stars, thinking about a species that had looked at the infinite cruelty of existence and decided, somewhere along the line, to give it back. The human transport would arrive in 11 hours. He found himself wondering, for the first time, whether what was coming to help them might be nearly as frightening as what they were up against. He decided he didn't want to know the answer yet. The docking bay of Station Theta had been prepared meticulously. Honor guard of 12 Velkari soldiers in ceremonial armor, a formal welcome delegation, banners of alliance, Sireth himself, wearing his full diplomatic regalia, standing at the base of the ramp. The ship's doors opened with a hydraulic hiss. 12 humans walked out. Sireth had studied human anatomy in preparation. He understood their size, their biology, their relative physical fragility compared to most combat species. What no file had prepared him for was how ordinary they seemed. They wore mottled green-gray clothing, loose and worn. They carried heavy packs that clinked softly with gear. Several had cups of what Esireth had learned was called coffee, hot, bitter liquid they drank at all hours, as though their nervous systems required constant chemical management. Two of them were laughing at something, not politely, actually laughing, shoulder shaking, the kind that meant someone had said something genuinely funny 30 seconds ago and it was still landing. The one at the front, a tall, dark-skinned man with close-cropped hair and the quiet eyes of someone who had seen a great many things and filed them all away without flinching, stopped in front of Esireth and extended one hand. Esireth knew this gesture, a greeting. He took it carefully. "Master Sergeant Dara Osai," the man said, "and this is my team. We got your file on the Vreth situation during transit." He glanced up at the banners, at the honor guard, at the full diplomatic pageantry arrayed before him. "You didn't have to do all this." "We wanted to show proper respect," Esireth said. "Appreciated, but honestly, just show us the maps." Osai's eyes were already moving past the ceremony, scanning the room with the trained sweep of someone cataloging exits and threats simultaneously. "And wherever you've got the intel on the Rift anchor point, we want to move inside 48 hours. Behind him, a compact woman with sharp eyes, Sergeant Yuki Tanaka, the dossier said, demolitions and structural analysis, was already crouching beside one of the station's wall panels, studying it with idle professional curiosity. A broad-shouldered man named Corporal Jard Bren was asking a Velkari aide if the station had a gym. Another soldier, the youngest of the group, Private Kofi Mensah, was standing very still, looking out the bay window at the dark of space with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite awe, but something in between that Esireth couldn't name. The briefing room was assembled within the hour. Esireth walked them through everything. The Vreth's physiology as best as it was understood, the dimensional rift, the 11 destroyed systems, the 16 failed military engagements by 5 different species. He expected questions about psychic shielding, about energy weapon calibrations, about the frequency spectrums the Vreth occupied. Osai's first question was, what scares them? Esireth blinked. We do not believe they experience fear. Everything experiences fear, Osai said calmly. What have they avoided? Where haven't they gone? It was a question no one had thought to ask before. The room went quiet as Esireth pulled up the movement maps, and there it was, a gap. A small system the Vreth had curved around, barely perceptibly in their advance. Nothing remarkable about it, except that system had a resonance pulse event 6 cycles ago, Esireth said slowly. A dying star. The shockwave would have created a specific dimensional frequency. Write that frequency down, Osai said to Tanaka. She was already writing. That night, long after the formal dinner that the humans attended politely and mostly in silence, Esireth walked the corridors of the station and found one of the soldiers sitting alone in an empty observation room. Private Mensah, cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, lips moving slightly. Esireth almost left. Then he heard it, names. A soft, steady list of names. He didn't know whose names they were. He didn't ask. He backed away quietly and didn't sleep until morning. The insertion point was a dead moon called Thresh 4, scarred black with craters, orbiting a gas giant on the outer edge of Vreth-controlled space. No atmosphere worth the name. Temperature -90 on the surface. The team moved across it in single file, breath fogging inside their helmet visors, and nobody spoke. Esireth had insisted on accompanying them. Os had not argued, which Esireth understood later was because Os had wanted a witness. Not for glory, for record. If something worked, the conclave needed to know exactly what and how. The Vreth scout found them 40 minutes after landing. Escireth felt it before he saw it, a pressure behind his eyes, a cold certainty that something nearby wanted to consume him, body and mind and memory together. He had read the reports. He understood intellectually what the Vreth did. Understanding did nothing to prevent the paralysis that seized his legs when the thing materialized 30 meters ahead of them. A towering column of dark energy that pulsed with something that felt obscenely like hunger. He looked at Osai. Osai was already moving not away but sideways, fast and low, hand signals snapping to the team. They split without a word. Tanaka right, Bren left, two others circling wide. The scout Vreth turned, tracking the largest cluster of psychic signatures. Escireth realized with cold clarity that they were using his fear, his panic, as bait. He forced himself to stand still. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. The Vreth surged forward. What happened next took 11 seconds. Escireth had reviewed the helmet footage many times afterward, and it still didn't fully make sense to him as a sequence of events. 3 shaped charges detonated in a geometric pattern around the creature. Not to destroy it, the charges were far too small for that, but to force it into a specific corridor of space. Tanaka had calculated the resonance frequency on the transport. The charges were tuned to it. As the Vreth compressed into the kill zone, Bren fired a modified pulse weapon directly into its energy core. A shot that shouldn't have worked by any physics Escireth knew, and did. The Vreth came apart, not dramatically, quietly like a sound being switched off. Silence on the moon's surface. Osai walked to the dispersal point, crouched, and checked something on a handheld instrument. Tanaka was already crouching beside the residual energy signature, scanning, taking samples. Escireth stood very still and tried to remember how to breathe. "Is it?" he managed. "Dead," Tanaka confirmed, not looking up. "Resonance disruption worked. Frequency needs slight adjustment for larger specimens, but the principle holds." She made a note. "Same as any apex predator, they have a frequency at which their structural coherence collapses. You just have to find it." "You used my fear," Escireth said. The words came out strange. Not accusatory, just factual. "Your fear gave off a strong psychic signal," Osai said, standing. "It was the best lure available. I should have told you beforehand. I apologize for that." He said it simply, without deflection. "You held your ground. That took courage." "I was terrified," Escireth said. "Yes," Osai agreed. "That's what courage is." They spent 2 hours on the moon afterward, not resting, cataloging. The humans moved through the dispersal field with methodical care, instruments out, mapping everything, building a picture of a creature no living being had ever successfully killed before. Escireth watched them work and tried to identify the feeling in his chest. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something colder and more reliable than hope. It was the feeling of watching professionals do what they were made for. On the transport back, Mensa sat beside Escireth and offered him a protein bar without comment. Escireth took it. They sat in silence for a while. "Were you afraid?" Escireth finally asked. Mensa looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Always am." He paused. "Doesn't go away, you just learn to work while it's happening." Escireth thought about that for the entire journey home. While Osai's team pushed deeper into contested space, Escireth made a decision he would later describe to colleagues as the most disturbing thing he had ever voluntarily done. He ordered the complete human historical warfare archive. The Conclave's intelligence division had compiled it over 6 months at his earlier request, but he had read only the summary. 16 pages, statistics, numbers, the dry language of threat assessment. Now, sitting alone in his quarters while the team slept and the station hummed around him, he opened the full document. It was 4,312 pages long. He started at the beginning. Ancient conflicts, primitive weapons, territorial disputes that wiped out thousands. He expected it to thin out as the species matured, as they developed governance and law and philosophy. Every species' history showed that arc, the savage early period giving way to structured civilization, violence decreasing as complexity increased. Humans didn't follow that arc. The violence scaled with the complexity. As their technology advanced, so did the lethality. They invented gunpowder and immediately applied it to killing each other. They split the atom and within a decade pointed it at their own cities. They developed biological science, a field of study whose entire premise was understanding life, and within the same century weaponized it into agents capable of killing millions. Every tool they ever made, they made a weapon version of it. Every science they ever discovered, someone in a building somewhere was already calculating the military applications. And then there was the psychological dimension, which was somehow worse. They had not merely killed each other. They had developed sophisticated systems of psychological dismantlement, studied methods for breaking an enemy's will before the first physical blow was struck. They understood how the mind worked and used that understanding against itself. They had trained individuals to resist their own minds under pressure, and then trained other individuals to apply that pressure. At page 2000, SCI-FI stopped and sat back and stared at the wall for a very long time. What he was sitting with was not the brutality. He was old enough to have seen brutality across a dozen species. What unsettled him was the iteration, the endless, patient, multi-generational refinement of the art of violence. Every war taught them something. Every defeat was studied, catalogued, corrected. They failed and adapted and came back with something worse and more efficient. For 4,000 years, they had been running an unbroken research program into the most effective means of ending things that did not want to end. And the 12 people currently sleeping aboard Station Theta were the latest output of that program. He read the individual dossiers again with new eyes. HFY, Master Sergeant, 22 years in service, 4 major engagements, 3 commendations, and a psychological evaluation that noted he processed traumatic events through mission-focused compartmentalization with no observed long-term degradation in function. Whatever that meant, SCI-FI thought, it sounded like a description of a machine that refused to break. Tanaka, Explosives and Structural Analysis, had published 3 academic papers on energy wave propagation in her spare time. Her service record included a note that she had once continued a mission for 6 hours with an untreated fracture in her right arm, because stopping would have compromised the objective. Mensa, the youngest, had joined at 18. His file noted a standardized psychological resilience score in the 98th percentile. SCI-FI didn't fully understand what percentile meant in human statistical systems, but he grasped the implication. He set down the data pad. A message pinged from the forward team. Osai's voice, flat and businesslike. We've located the rift anchor point. It's guarded by what the energy readings suggest is a primary Vreth entity significantly larger than anything previously recorded. We're going in tomorrow. Thought you should know. SCI-FI looked at the 4,000-page document on his screen, then at the message, then back at the document. He thought about the Vreth Elder, 4,000 years old, a being that had consumed civilizations, a creature that had never, not once, faced something it could not simply consume. Then he thought about 12 humans in worn boots drinking coffee. For the first time since Aurelian Prime blinked out, he felt something that was not despair. He wasn't sure yet what to call it. The rift anchor existed in a dimensional fold between 2 dead star systems, a place where space itself had been physically torn, not metaphorically, not by any normal physics, but literally peeled back like skin from muscle, raw and leaking wrongness into the surrounding vacuum. From 300 kilometers out, it looked like a bruise on reality. Up close, it looked like a mouth. The Elder was inside it. SCI-FI felt it from the transport the moment they crossed within 100 kilometers. Every cell in his body told him to turn around. Not fear exactly, something more fundamental than fear. The deep biological instruction buried in every living thing that says, this is a predator. This is something that kills and cannot be reasoned with. The elder's presence was a psychic pressure that bypassed conscious thought entirely and went straight to instinct. He watched the humans from the transport's feed. They were running pre-mission checks, calibrating weapons, tapping things. Bren was adjusting something on his shoulder rig with a small tool and the expression of a man fixing a leaky faucet. Tanaka had her head down over a data pad, lips moving silently over calculations. Ose sat with his eyes closed, not sleeping. Sirith had learned to tell the difference. In the particular stillness, the sergeant moved into before action, like a blade being held edge outward. The team inserted through a secondary fold point. The elder became aware of them immediately. What happened to the first two soldiers, Corporals Enkemdi and Park? Sirith watched on the helmet feeds and would never fully describe to anyone afterward. The elder didn't move. It reached psychically with a force like a star collapsing, and the two soldiers simply went down. Not dead. Their vitals remained barely, but they were gone inside themselves, pulled under by a weight no human mind was built to resist. The team stopped moving. The elder, if it could be said to feel anything, seemed to feel amusement. Its energy column pulsed with something that all the xenopsychologists later agreed had the frequency signature of contempt. It had done this to gods, to psychic titans that dwarfed these small creatures in every measurable way. This was not a fight. It was a meal experiencing a brief inconvenience. Osei opened his eyes. 3 more soldiers went to their knees as the psychic pressure spiked, a physical force. Sirith's instruments showed, equivalent to multiple G-forces pressing from the inside out. Tanaka stayed upright but was clearly fighting for it, every muscle in her jaw locked. Mensa, on his knees, had both hands pressed flat on the floor and was breathing in a specific counted rhythm that Sirith would later learn was a technique developed to maintain function during extreme stress. Osei stood up. He had gone down briefly. The helmet feed showed 2 seconds on one knee. Then he was up, walking forward, toward the elder, slowly with the steady gait of a man who had decided something and was now simply executing it. Blood from a ruptured blood vessel ran from his left ear. His biometrics showed a heart rate of 94, elevated but not the desperate spike of panic. Controlled elevation, the heart rate of someone working hard. The elder's psychic presence intensified. In the feed, Sirith watched Osei's jaw tighten, an involuntary response, the only one. Then the sergeant stopped, looked up at the towering column of consuming dark energy and said, very calmly, "We've had worse." The elder was silent, and then Sirith's instruments flagged it before he consciously registered it. The psychic pressure changed frequency. Not increased, changed. Something in the elder's output shifted in a way that the conclave's xenopsychologists, when they reviewed the data, would spend 6 months arguing about before finally agreeing on a term. Uncertainty. The elder was uncertain. For the first time in 4,000 years, it had encountered something it could not immediately categorize. It pressed harder. Ose didn't move. The 3 kneeling soldiers dragged themselves upright one by one, using each other, using the walls, using whatever was there. Mensa stood last, shaking, and looked directly at the elder with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and refusal. It was the refusal that changed everything. Because the Vreth fed on surrender, on the psychic collapse of a mind giving way. And these things, these small, fragile, biologically unremarkable things were not giving way. They were absorbing the pressure and standing back up, slowly, painfully, again and again, like they had been practicing exactly this for their entire lives. Because they had, what followed was not glorious. Sirith wanted to be clear about this when he wrote his report afterward. Across the galaxy, when this story eventually spread, and it did spread, the way all impossible things spread, person to person, system to system, until it became something between history and myth, people imagined it as a grand battle. Lights and explosions. Noble sacrifice framed in cinematic slow motion. It wasn't like that. It was 4 hours of methodical, grinding, merciless work. Tanaka had the resonance device half-built during the insertion. She finished it on the floor of the rift chamber with her left hand because her right had been caught in a secondary psychic shockwave, and the fingers wouldn't fully close. She didn't mention this to anyone. She simply worked with the other hand and occasionally held a component with her teeth while she fastened a connector. Bren's job was the worst one. The resonance device needed to be anchored to the rift's physical membrane, the raw edge of torn space, from the inside, meaning someone had to go into the fold itself, a few meters into the dimensional tier, and physically bolt the device to a substrate that wasn't supposed to exist in three-dimensional space. SCI-FI had asked in the planning stage whether this was survivable. OS had not answered that question directly. Bren had volunteered anyway. He went unconscious. He came out 40 minutes later, and he was conscious for approximately 3 minutes after that before his body made a decision his will couldn't override and he lost consciousness. But he had done it. The device was anchored. His vitals were stable enough. SCI-FI learned later that Bren had known going and what the dimensional exposure would likely cost him and had gone anyway, calmly, as if it were a normal logistical problem with an acceptable solution. The Elder fought them the entire time. Not in a physical sense, it had no physical form that could be grappled with. It fought psychically in waves, targeting individuals with focused pressure, looking for the one that would break and give it purchase. It found nothing it could use. Every time it found an edge, the human it was pressing would shift, not away from the pressure but into it, absorbing it, redirecting it, running on something that wasn't courage exactly but was something more sustainable than courage. Stubbornness, perhaps, or the 4,000-year-old muscle memory of a species that had survived every catastrophe it had ever built for itself. When the device activated, the rift chamber filled with a frequency that had no sound in normal space, but registered on SCI-FI's instruments as a wall. The Elder reacted for the first time with something unmistakably like alarm. Its energy column contracted, pulled in, tried to compress away from the frequency. Osai's team closed the distance immediately. What they did in the next 6 minutes with modified pulse weapons, improvised dimensional shunts, and raw physical positioning SCI-FI's instruments recorded faithfully, but he couldn't fully reconstruct in sequence. It was too fast, too layered, too simultaneous. What he could tell, watching the energy readings, was this: the Elder tried to flee. Osai's team did not let it. They had planned for this. The flanking positions, the secondary charges, the dimensional anchors Mensa had been placing for the last 2 hours while everyone else held the Elder's attention. It was a net. The Elder hit every edge of it and found a human waiting there, weapon up, expression flat, absolutely immovable. The ancient entity that had consumed civilizations was contained in a shrinking field by 8 people in worn boots. Then the device reached full power. The Elder's collapse was felt across 9 star systems simultaneously. SCI-FI's instruments registered it. Every Vreth entity in the sector registered it. They felt their oldest, their most powerful, their first dissolve like smoke in a high wind. The effect was immediate and total. Vreth across the sector stopped moving. Some simply ceased. Others retreated back toward the rift, which was already collapsing with the Elder's death. Osai stood in the center of the chamber and watched the rift seal itself for a long time without speaking. Tanaka sat on the floor and let her injured hand rest in her lap. Mensa, covered in something dark that SCI-FI didn't want to examine too closely, had his head bowed. 7 had walked in. 4 were walking out. The others were alive, barely. Bren, Nkemdi, Park, breathing, stable, each of them carrying something in their bodies that the medics would spend months working to understand. Osai looked at SCI-FI through the helmet feed. "Close the rift," he said, "and get a medical team to Bren." That was all he said. No triumph, no speech, no moment held for the cameras that weren't there, just the next task on the list. The Galactic Conclave convened an emergency session 14 hours after the rift collapsed. 300 delegates from 61 species, the same assembly that had sat in terrified silence watching Aurelian Prime die. Now they sat in a different kind of silence, the silence of people trying to recalibrate something they thought they understood. The Vreth advance had stopped, not paused, stopped. In systems across the sector, the remaining entities had retreated into diminishing pockets that the Conclave's own forces, emboldened, suddenly and finally by having a frequency weapon to point, were managing without difficulty. The rift was sealed. The Elder was gone. 11 systems remained destroyed, their populations unreturnable. That grief was real and enormous and would last generations. But the advance was over. It had been stopped by 12 people in 48 hours. Delegate Mur of the Korathi moved that the humans be awarded the Conclave's highest honor, the Star of Velharith, and that Master Sergeant Os be invited to address the full assembly. The motion passed unanimously. Osai declined the address. He sent a brief written message instead. "Thank you for the honor. Our team would prefer the time be used for medical support for the injured. Please direct any ceremony toward that purpose." Esireth delivered the medals personally to a small room in the station's medical wing, where the survivors sat in 2 clusters. Os, Tanaka, Mensa, and 2 others who had made it through largely intact sat on one side. Bren was in a medical unit stable, the doctors said with careful qualifications, alongside Enkemdi and Park, who were conscious and improving. Esireth placed the medals on the table. Nobody touched them for a while. Then Osai reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and took out a small, folded card. He opened it carefully, the way someone handles a thing that has been handled many times and is still precious. He began reading names aloud. Not loudly, not for an audience, just reading them. Esireth recognized 2 of the names, the soldiers who had not come back from the rift chamber. But there were more names on the card than 2. Many more. Names from before this mission. Names from years and conflicts preceding the Vreth, preceding the Conclave, preceding anything Esireth had any connection to. Private names. Mission names. The names of people Osai had served with, and lost in places across a human history that Esireth had spent 3 days reading and still did not fully understand. The others in the room were quiet while he read. When he finished, he folded the card and put it back in his pocket. That night, the Conclave's emergency political session ran for 9 hours. Representatives argued fiercely and honestly about what to do with humanity now. Some called for full integration, bring them in, give them full Conclave membership, let them into the shared defense structure. Others argued for caution. One delegate, a quiet elder from a species called the Vethsari, whose entire civilization was built on philosophies of pacifism, stood at the podium for a long time before speaking. "We are grateful," she said at last, profoundly, without question, a pause, "but I need to ask the thing I think we are all avoiding." She looked around the chamber. The Vreth were ancient, powerful beyond our ability to contest. They fed on psychic energy across dimensions. They were, by every measure we possess, one of the most formidable entities in the known galaxy. Another pause. These humans stopped them in 2 days. Her voice was very careful. "My question for this body is this. If they can do that to the Vreth, what, in their own history, did they do to each other?" The chamber was silent for a very long time. Esireth, sitting in the observer gallery, looked down at his data pad. The 4,000-page archive. He thought about not answering. Then he thought about Osai reading names from a folded card, quietly, for no one but himself, and the people who understood what the names meant. He set the pad face down on his knee. "Everything," he said softly, to no one in particular. "They did everything to each other." He paused. "And then they came here anyway." 3 years later, Esireth took a sabbatical. He had earned it. The Vreth containment accords had taken 14 months to negotiate. The political aftermath of the Rift battle was complex, long, and often exhausting. Humanity had been offered full Conclave membership and accepted it with a brevity that the diplomatic corps found faintly rude. Their representative at the signing ceremony shook hands with everyone, signed the documents, and asked where the cafeteria was. The Conclave had spent 6 months preparing a speech for the occasion. The human simply said, "Glad to be part of it, let's get to work." In the years that followed, human special forces teams became something between an institution and a legend. They didn't replace the Conclave's other military capabilities. They supplemented them, specifically and precisely, called in for the situations that other species couldn't handle and didn't fully understand. There were never very many of them at once. They didn't need to be many. The galaxy had learned something about what a small number of prepared humans could accomplish when given a clear objective and enough coffee. No one invaded human space. This was not an explicit treaty obligation. It was simply that after the footage of the Rift battle circulated, not officially released but leaked, quietly, in the way important things leak, no species with military ambitions in that direction felt that the return on investment was compelling. The humans went about their expansion with the calm, unhurried confidence of a species that had made its point and didn't need to keep making it. SCI-FI's sabbatical destination was Earth. He had earned it, he felt, having never actually visited the planet behind the species that had changed everything. He landed in a small agricultural region in what the humans called West Africa, Ghana, specifically, a country with deep red soil and enormous trees, and more colors of green than SCI-FI's species had words for. The farm he was looking for was at the end of an unpaved road that wound through fields of maize and something that smelled extraordinary. Dara Osai was in the garden when SCI-FI arrived. He was older, not greatly. 3 years is not long for most species, and humans seemed to carry age well when they were out of combat, and wearing clothes that were practical and stained at the knees and had nothing to do with military service. He looked up, saw SCI-FI, and smiled with a genuineness that the diplomat in SCI-FI noted was rare even among diplomatic professionals. "I was wondering if you'd come," Osai said. He had a cup in his hand. Of course he had a cup. They sat on a low wooden structure outside the farmhouse while the sun moved. They talked about the Conclave's politics, about the Vethsari delegates' continued philosophical objections to humanity's membership, about Bren's recovery, slow but steady, the doctors now cautiously optimistic, and about the farm, which Os had inherited from his grandmother and was working back into production with a patience that seemed at odds with everything SCI-FI had watched him do under pressure. Finally, SCI-FI asked the thing he had come to ask. "Will humanity always be like this?" He tried to find more precise words and couldn't. "The way you are, what you're capable of, what you're willing to do, will that always be part of what you are?" Osai was quiet for a while. He looked out across the fields, and SCI-FI noticed the same quality in his eyes that Mensa had once described, the acknowledgement of fear and the decision to proceed regardless. Not the absence of something, the presence of something chosen. "We're working on it," he said finally. It was not the answer SCI-FI had expected. He turned it over on the long transit home, parsing its layers. Not, "We're trying to stay this way." Not, "We're trying to become different." Working on it, both things simultaneously, the violence and the healing, the capacity and the cost, the 4,000-page history and the names on the folded card. A species that had burned itself to the ground a dozen times and kept building something from the ash. He was still thinking about it 11 months later when the deep-range sensors on the galactic rim registered a new rift signature, larger than the first, much larger. The Conclave's emergency alert system went live across 61 species. The debate in the chamber lasted exactly 4 minutes before Delegate Mer moved the only motion that made sense. The message to Earth was 3 words. "We need you." The response came back in under a minute. No deliberation, no committees, just a manifest of names, a departure time, and a postscript that SCI-FI read twice before he understood it was not a threat but a statement of simple and absolute fact. "Already on our way."